All right, here we are. Common Sense, Ohio. We are on January 24th, 2025. Imagine that. We are plowing through the year already at an alarming pace. We got a guest today, but we're going to still bookend this. We're still going to talk about our what this day in history. I'm going to start off with a couple of quotes, though. One is, nothing in life is so exhilarating as to be shot at without result. I found that to be a very telling quote. Another, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Also very relevant for this day. And then one that'll give this away. Never give in, never give in, never, 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 and nothing, great or small, large or petty, never give in except to convictions of honor and good sense. Never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that, of course, is our friend Winston Churchill, who died on this day in 1965.
Okay. Wow. Very good. Very good.
He, all you have to do is Google his quotes, and you get hundreds of them. I mean, every one of them is just, and I presume they're all accurate and attributable to him, but that's at least what the internet says, and that's always right, for far as I can tell.
Yeah, I always wonder about quotes. Are they writing them down themselves, or do they have this person walking behind him just waiting for these drops?
Winston wrote his stuff meticulously. All his speeches were meticulously prepared. I think he was even dyslexic, and he spent lots of time sort of revising what he would say. He was very, very skilled in the art of writing, but it came painfully to him, I think, from what I understand. But anyway, for the typical intro is commonsenseohioshow.com if you want to check us out on the web, or you can check us out on the socials, on YouTube, on Rumble, or wherever you get your stuff. We are probably there. Norm, we're gonna buzz right to this because we've got a guest from the Buckeye Institute right here in Ohio. We are the Buckeye State, so that makes sense. I'll let you take it from here.
Yeah, so we have Greg Lawson in the house here via Zoom. The terrible weather we're having right now in central Ohio. So Greg's the smart guy coming in electronically. The drive was harrowing this morning from Johnstown, let me tell you. So Greg is, Greg, this doesn't do you justice, but in your email, it says that you're research fellow, which makes it sound like you're one of 400 research fellows. I'm just going to say this. I think you're the all-arounder policy guy, who where the rubber meets the road over there at the Buckeye Institute. And you don't have to clarify it if you don't want to, but you've been there a while. You've been a guest on the show before, and you know a lot about a lot of things. And so with that, I've worked with the Buckeye Institute in other parts of my life previously, professionally, and I can't even think of a policy position that you've ever put out in the last 25 years that I've disagreed with. It's very much common sense, pro free market, pro private property rights, pro free speech and expression, pro civil rights institute. So, and it's been consistent through various management changes over the years. So, welcome, Greg.
Well, hey, thanks for having me an awful lot. I really appreciate it. I appreciate a chance to talk to everybody. I really like the history there. Winston Churchill is a great leader. I didn't realize today was actually the date of his passing, so that's quite that's a very interesting tidbit. But we look back very fondly on him, and are hoping that we can get that kind of leadership, I think, across the whole Western world. I mean, I think a lot of people are pretty happy with the last week or so here in the United States, but there's still a lot of places in Europe, including Winston Churchill's own country, where I think some folks are looking for a little more spine, a little more strength, a little more belief in really Western civilization. So it's kind of a refreshing thing to hear that, because it kind of gets you excited. But thanks for having me. There's a lot of stuff going on here in Ohio politics, and Ohio policy is getting ready to happen. We got a new legislature starting here, and honestly, it's going to be exciting, both because of some basically state political developments that I think are probably going to make things a little more clarified at the State House, and probably lead to more stuff moving in this cycle than the last one. But then, of course, with all the change in Washington, that's going to have a lot of downstream impacts on what the state can do too, because there's obviously a lot of influence on federal policy on what states can do. So I'm actually really excited about this year. The weather is not that great, and I will say this: I'm from Kansas, so I was a kid born there. I've been in Ohio for most of my life. I was 7 years old when I moved here, but I will say that as bad as this is, Kansas is worse. But the one thing I have going for me right now, and that I'm really excited about, is Ohio State wins a national championship, and I'm an Ohio State grad, so that's really wonderful. But I'm legitimately a Kansas City Chiefs fan, and was a Chiefs fan before the rise of Patrick Mahomes. So I just want to put it there, because I know there's a lot of people that are now probably Kansas City Chiefs fans because he's, this stellar athlete and player. But longtime Chiefs fans, so we're going through a run, and I'm hoping that we'll have both Ohio State and Kansas City winning in football. That would be great.
Well, so half the show today was born in Kansas. I was born in Dodge City. So
Wow.
I was a big Hank Stram fan back in the day. So
Sure.
I've always loved the Chiefs. But
I was born in Hayes,
I'm a
Kansas.
Bengals guy now.
Well, they're my second favorite, honestly. I grew up, my first Super Bowl, I don't want to bring up bad memories or anything, but it was a great game. But it was the second Bengals-Niners one, there with Boomer. That was my first Super Bowl I ever played.
Whose actual name is Norman.
Yes. Well, there you go.
Yeah, Norman Boomer.
Is this your way of trying to get us to call you Boomer?
Wow, that's pretty cool. By the way, I was born in Hayes, Kansas.
There you go.
Yeah, right next to Russell. Bob Dole's the city was Russell, and so we were right next door there.
Well, Greg, you authored the most recent position paper came out a couple days ago on energy policy. I believe you were the author of that, or was that the higher education one? You were co-author.
Co-author with our vice president Ray Hederman, who's done wonderful work. And I'll just say we have a great team of economists. We have lawyers. We do litigation, pro bono litigation for folks, but to try to make sure we establish the right kind of standards in courts that preserves liberty and things. So we have a great.
We had when you appeared last time, we had Dave Tryon, who's one of your senior litigators on the show.
Great.
Yeah,
he's great. Does a lot of good stuff.
So let me ask you this: on your energy policy, one of the things we've talked about here at the table that I think is inevitable, because you've got these PUCO filings from AEP and other providers in Ohio that are saying with Anduril coming in and whatever creature now owns the Intel project, there seems, and Amazon, I think, said they're going to spend $2 billion or $20 billion or some crazy. They're going to build 2 new data centers beyond what they already committed to. So there is this term of art, modular nuclear plants, and even in your artwork for your paper, it shows nuclear power plants. Even though I don't think the paper specifically says nuclear. But Ohio's had a rocky history. They canceled the Zimmer plant down in Cincinnati years ago and made it a coal gasification plant when it was supposed to be a nuclear plant. And so I'm just wondering, right? Amazon bought 3 Mile Island, or they're going to recommission the reactor there that was shut down, not the one that melted down, the other one, because there were 2 reactors. So they're going to bring that back. And there seems to be a pro-nuke thing going on. Can you tell us what you guys are thinking about? Is it these small modular plants that will service a given data center or 2? Or do you think Ohio is going to have to build 2 or 3 full-size nuclear plants?
Sure. Well, and so several points on that, and you set it up very well. In the paper that we had released the other day, what we were really trying to get a point across is we knew there was going to be some major energy legislation coming, especially in the wake of all the things that you were just describing. So we wanted to kind of get out in front of it. And as a matter of fact, that interestingly enough, the legislation, the initial draft dropped yesterday in the State House of Representatives. But we wanted to get out there and say, look, Ohio has had kind of a sketchy history of energy policy over the last, really since the dawn of the 21st century. And we need to have as much of a market-based approach to this as possible. There was an effort to do that in the late 90s. We tried to do a deregulation where we essentially kind of split generation and distribution up so that you can have competitive generation and producing of the electricity, because that doesn't need to, that needs a lot less regulation, needs safety regulations and things maybe, but it doesn't need the same kind of regulation that wires and the delivery and transmission needs, because that's where you really need to go to the PUCO, because that, you can't have multiple wires going into the same property. That's inefficient. So somebody's going to do that. That's what they call the natural monopoly, which is why it's harder to have a market-based approach to wires and distribution versus generation. So we think generation is critical. We need to be energy in terms of the resource agnostic, in terms of what's the best thing that can work the best is what we should be doing. And we shouldn't be putting our fingers on the scale to weigh it in favor of any particular thing. And that goes for, and I've testified over the years in General Assembly against everything from coal subsidies to certainly renewable standards where you have to mandate a certain percentage of electricity is generated from, wind or solar, and set asides for specific things. Testified against that ill-fated and controversial and frankly corrupt House Bill 6 that had passed, obviously, a number of years ago, and the nuke subsidies for the plants that were the ones up north there that were formerly owned by First Energy. So the report was really trying to stake out this territory of let's be free market. Okay. And because we need to unshackle things, it also gets down to permitting reform so you can build more stuff. Now that's where we tie back into things like the nuclear. And I do think nuclear is probably likely the future. I think for all the reasons that were cited, these data centers are just ravenous consumers of electricity. It's like whole small villages is one, you can have thousands and thousands of homes. An entire city almost, or at least a smaller city, is one data center. And then when you pop up multiple of these, the demand just is really massive. Now we may find ways to be more efficient in the future and not need as much, but for right now, that's what's happening.
Yeah, I think Duke and AEP here in Ohio have told the PUCO they're not going to have the capacity. Yeah. Ohio keeps bringing in these data centers, and they're basically saying we got to be doing something else.
Well, and what's worrisome, and what and there's a number of things I think we can do. This legislation, I think, has actually got some really good provisions that are going to be a step in the right direction. And I think there's some other stuff. We've got to get more generation. Eventually, it's going to be nuclear. So I will say I do think the small modular reactors is probably where things are going to go. There's a lot of different designs that are being worked on. There's a lot of work with the regulatory folks in Washington to try to get sort of turnkey sort of designs that you can do. I think that you're probably going to see more of those, to your point, than you are singular. I don't know that you're going to see like the 3 Mile Islands or even the Davis-Besse and the Perry plants we have here in Ohio. I don't think you're going to see quite as many of those big ones. I think you're going to see smaller ones that may even be working directly with one of the tech guys, whether it's the Amazon or the Meta for Facebook and all those kind of things, Amazon. You're going to, I think, see a lot more direct collaboration. You may see what they call co-location, where you have energy plants very closely located and located so that they are the primary producer for that data center.
Yeah.
I think the other critical point to that is we should want that, because that also would mitigate pulling off of the general grid.
Which will drive up our residential prices if
Correct.
we don't do something.
Well, now that just brings, I have all sorts of questions about this now. So it seems like there's this general pushback on the other side to nuclear. If you get to the environmentalists, they're immediately they don't like nuclear, even though that seems like I don't want to call it limitless, but a very clean.
The dumbest position I think they have, because let's be blunt about it. I get everybody's afraid because everybody thinks of Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island, right?
Yeah, and then the China syndrome.
Maybe Fukushima there in Japan, but we have newer designs, very safe designs. And if you are a person who is concerned about carbon emissions into the atmosphere, these are zero greenhouse gas emission plants. They truly are clean energy. Now, a lot of green activists only want you to do wind and sun. And that's just an insane, frankly, idea, because there can be a role, but it's probably going to always, until battery storage at least gets up to industrial size scale, it's going to be a very subsidiary role because it's intermittent power that can't be on all the time because it's contingent on.
So Greg, let me support you with a couple of things just very quickly. So just this week, there was a major battery farm fire at Moss Landing, California. Right, and that's in this beautiful Monterey County, right? Pristine area, and that battery farm, it's lithium, and one of them got going and caught fire, and the whole farm went major fire. And the point of that battery farm was to regulate the dips in power so that California would not have brownouts, but that's ridiculous because you're depending on batteries. It's kind of like what happened in Texas with the windmills during the wintertime freezing up. And Texas, of all places, with all the gas and oil, suddenly people have outages for energy in a energy-rich state like Texas. So to your point, the windmills, the battery farms, this stuff is not reliable. We need reliable and affordable energy per your report, per your paper. So I just wanted to support that because that's in the news right now.
Well, let me ask. I'm going to geek out. I'm an attorney too, so I like to geek out on some of these legal issues. And Norm, you were talking a little bit about having these smaller plants, modular plants.
Yeah.
And it's almost like I can almost see a private factory or Amazon or the Intel or one of these people saying, we don't need you, Mr. Government. We're just going to have our own little nuclear plant here. And then I can see the government saying, no, you're not allowed to do that. We've preempted the field on this. And the government gets to control the energy. I just see this.
Yeah.
I can foresee this. Like if I wanted to put if I live in a city and I want to put a windmill in my backyard and supply my own energy, they're not going to let me do that. They're going to zone that out. How's the government going to work with these sort of pseudo or semi-private energy producing plants?
Yeah.
Well, that is a great question, and I think we need to constantly be looking at that. And that's one of the things that we're looking at a little bit. It wasn't in this particular report, but is to look at how do we facilitate that co-location I was talking about before, which is what you're really talking about, and making sure you've got to do several things. You've got to make sure your zoning is right. Now, I will say, it won't be the case for every jurisdiction. We all know that there's some, not to be mean-spirited about it, but there's a lot of petty tyranny in local government.
That's right. And there's a lot of money made in local government.
Right.
There is. And that's one of the reasons why I'm hopeful, though, that as these bigger companies are coming in with these opportunities, this is one area where that can leverage to the advantage of saying that local governments will want some of those folks here. And if in order to get those folks here, you have to have some sort of energy production that we may be able to acquiesce on some of the more rigid sort of approaches. Now, I suspect there will be some suburbs or some individual communities that will still do that, still create the problems that you're talking about. But I think zoning zoning and permitting are the two biggest things. Now, some of the permitting stuff is going to be a little more on the federal side. A lot of it is because of when you're dealing with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and stuff.
Yeah,
I'm hopeful, and we've heard some rumblings and some positive things, and the whole sort of all of the above energy push that the new Trump administration is doing. We're hopeful, and we certainly, and again, we do mention that pretty specifically in the report about the need for permitting reform, and a lot of that's federal, but there is going to be some state stuff that we need to do to streamline and make sure that is as quick as possible. So
yeah,
it is a problem. I could definitely see there being issues on a case-by-case basis. There's also the chance, though, if that becomes so pervasive that it really limits the build-out as we start moving 2 or 3 years or maybe 5, down the road. If this becomes such a handicap that all the people trying to come here with the data centers and things are saying, wow, this isn't working. Or if we start seeing a situation where because they're plugging into the grid, we have really high jacked up prices on residents and other commercial,
right,
which is going to create. And by the way, that would be really bad, especially
that would be really bad, and that would be an argument for letting them build these modular. plants.
Oh,
You
I
know,
think it's a wonderful argument for it. There's
just-
also microgrids that you can do, which
Okay.
could now there's some law changes that you need to do that because you would have
Yeah.
to allow for some of these things to be set up on basically areas that investor-owned utilities have. They have monopolistic
Yeah.
regions where they do the wire, and then they go to the Public Utilities Commission to get basically rate of return on the fixed capital that they're doing when they're deploying the actual lines and transmission. And
Yeah,
there's really no way around dealing with that. That is a that's a natural monopoly for the reasons I was talking about before, where you don't want 15 different companies with 15 different wires into
Right.
buildings and stuff. You get that one service territory, and then they have to go and prove what they need plus a little bit of profit to keep them in the business and keep reinvesting.
It's just like different railroad companies use the same tracks. It's the same concept.
And so you have to. The one thing is though that if so to do microgrids, we're going to have to modify the statute because that would allow for there to be something that's essentially off the big grid, but would still be within a service territory of a utility. And so there's some regulatory things and there's a lot of things that I'm not even sure that I know all the details of how that would work. That would be a lawyer's. There'd be a lot of people making a lot of money on billable hours. Working.
If you remember, Nikola Tesla tried a local city distribution system without any wires. He built that big.
That would be awesome, right?
Remember, he built that big tall tower in the middle.
Yes.
I think it was Colorado Springs. And then through the atmosphere, your light bulbs would turn on and off, like with a switch, just from static electricity. It was a crazy idea, but it's an example of a community grid. The other thing that Steve brought up about factories and businesses having their own power supply, and this might be a historical note that maybe you'll put in a paper someday, but like Henry Ford. If you go to Dearborn, the Greenfield Village, and do the tour of old technology, to run the Rouge River plant, Ford Motor Company had its own coal-burning power plant, and they supplied their own energy, just like Steve said. So there's precedent for factories or other entities to provide their own power.
And I think we have to. And again, I agree. We kind of have to do it. We need to do it for them because that's going to be most efficient for them as they deploy their own capital and are building out those entities. I will say I think it's important because I do worry a lot about the existing grid and the existing impact on regular residential and commercial and smaller industrial folks that are already on. And we've had it. So far we're part of that PJM. We're part of actually a 13-state power grid, basically, that's run by a kind of a nonprofit entity, and it's kind of works in collaboration with different regulators and stuff. But so it's not Ohio's electricity grid. It's not just the Ohio electricity grid. Most states in the country are part of something. We're part of something called PJM. There's a Midwestern one. The only one that I think basically Texas is mostly their own grid. I think there's a few there's I think maybe there's a couple of cities that might fall into another grid, but Texas is like mostly its own. But that's the only state in the country that pretty much is run by its own separate grid. Most others are part of it, which creates an interesting dynamic in electricity markets because now you're dealing with not just what you're producing in Ohio, you're also dealing with what's getting stuck on the lines from other states and other production and what other states are doing with, putting new power in, taking power offline, which has been a problem, by the way.
Right.
Coal plants off power as we've made it more difficult to put new ones up, as we've, some of the renewable. Ohio is not that bad. We've actually done a relatively decent job in this space, but some of our other compatriot friends are trying to shut down even natural gas, which is natural gas is. And I should say this too. I think nuclear is the long-term fix.
Oh, for sure.
Right. All modulars. But I would say Ohio has a ton of natural gas. We have a lot of opportunity. It has become more competitive relative to coal, notwithstanding some of the regulatory issues, although I think that has been unfair to coal.
Well, Greg,
you need to get natural gas moving too.
Before we get to your higher ed, which I think we should get to next, I think Brett had.
Yeah, well, I was just going to ask, in your research, did you come up with any or hear about a timetable if we do go the modular route with the nuclear? How long does it take to build and put these online?
quicker than the old ones, but I mean, this isn't something, to your point, you don't just flip the switch, which is why we need to continue to get this, especially at the federal level. We got to get these. I think one of the big things we got to do is we got to get a series of sort of turnkey sort of approaches to it.
Yes.
So you have pre-approved sort of things. So you
Right.
if you go with this pre-approved model that's gone through certain safety standards and things like that, you get pre-approvals and stuff to begin the process and
Yes.
to do that. So it's still, I mean, I don't think you're going to see, it's probably still a decade or so, even I would say, before you're going to see the widespread use of these, which is another reason why the natural gas piece in Ohio is going to probably be an important role. And maybe the indispensable role, frankly, in the kind of short to medium term, because I think nuclear is still, it is coming. It is clear. Everybody knows it. This last year in particular, the discussion around it has just flown off the chart because everybody gets it. That has to be the case. And when the big tech guys are investing in things like 3 Mile Island and,
Right.
those kind of things and trying to figure out how you take things that have been mothballed, put them back in service, you're in a whole different era. But even that, I would be surprised if we get anything significant within the next decade. It's probably
Let's go to your higher ed because we have a lot of stuff to cover. Your higher ed paper that you authored, when did you hit the high spots on that higher education policy in Ohio? And let me just throw in something you didn't talk about. Maybe you will touch on this. Would be Buckeye's policy position on Title IX reform. But go ahead, tell us what is in your paper, if you can give us the thumbnails.
Yeah. So the big picture is we need to get a higher education system that is calibrated for the 21st century. We need to be able to have students going through getting degrees, frankly, more quickly for several reasons. First of all, we don't want to have people accumulating mass amounts of debt, right? That's been a major problem. We fought the Biden administration, as did a lot of people, when they were trying to wipe out the debt, thought that was a bad idea, terrible idea, moral hazard, everything else. That said, there is a real problem with students incurring debt, and part of that is how universities operate. There's a whole bunch of reasons why that happens, but we need to be able to get things more people in and out faster, connected to the needs of the workforce of today. We're talking about all those data centers and jobs and the various and the shifting that's going on in our economy, which nobody really totally understands where we're going to land. AI, the advent of AI, what is that going to mean? But the bottom line is that you can't just say that a four-year degree is the only ticket to success and to a good, solid life anymore. We need people to move at all walks of life, wherever they are, be able to get all kinds of different skills. Some may be four-year degrees or more, depending on the industry you're going in. But there's going to be a lot of stuff where you could do a two-year degree, or in some cases, maybe no degree at all, but a variety of certifications for various types of, and in some cases, maybe labor kind of jobs, but also obviously a lot of these kind of coding and technologically sophisticated jobs where you're going to go in and do stuff like that, even cybersecurity and things of that nature. So I don't think our higher education system is there yet. I think there have been some it's been creaking and groaning and trying to get there, but we want to push it in that direction. We want to reform it in such a way that we're getting students the right skills now. We're not saddling them with debt that makes them delay a lot of other things in life, which we've seen. There's tons of research that shows if you have a ton of student debt, there's delays in marriage, delays in house buying, all kinds of issues that are not good for society at large or the economy in the long run.
Greg, let me target one thing that I did not understand in your paper. It just went over my head, and I think Steve and Brett would be fascinated with this. So you talked about lowering the cost, both to the taxpayer and to the students, by requiring colleges and universities to guarantee some of these loans and accept some of the risk of non-payment, bankruptcy, whatever, to get the colleges and universities back into the free market. Because right now, they don't care. They can jack the tuition to whatever they want. The student can default, and the federal government, we're on the hook.
That's right. It's a non-dischargeable debt.
So how does putting the universities at risk for default on loans, how does that lower tuition cost? I could not figure out how you got from A to B.
Sure. The goal is to really focus in on putting their skin in the game. They're going to find ways to economize themselves. They're going to find ways to make sure that the programs they're doing are things that are going to get people out with less debt, more income, so there's less likelihood of default, because they're not going to want to then obviously be on the hook. So it's going to be something where they look at their own programs and hopefully, if you want some kind of highfalutin degree in something that's not necessarily a high paying thing, I'm not saying you shouldn't be able to get that, but you should be paying for that totally out of your own resources. That's not something where taxpayers should be subsidizing it either through upfront subsidies, which like the state of Ohio does have, or through essentially the back end subsidies through federal backed guarantees and loans and things like that. We need things that help. If you're going to have taxpayers putting resources in, there should be a return on investment. The return on investment is, what are the skills that these folks have? What kind of income can they earn? And how do they basically get back and put back into, obviously, by becoming good taxpayers themselves? And so we need to create that by the skin and making it hurt for universities that are basically not producing this. And right now, they don't care. To your point, you're absolutely right. They don't care what they're producing, because at the end of the day, they get their money up front, and you let the federal government and loan collectors and everything else go after the people who default. But it's not your problem anymore. It's kind of off. You wash your hands of a situation, whether they've got the job or they don't. And I don't want to say universities never try to do anything in that space, but to help students, I know I'm making them sound terrible, but at the end of the day, they're a money making enterprise, and they can make their money without that. We need to make it where they are really laser focused themselves on producing the product that is going to get those students what we need. And as they do that, cutting through that extraneous BS stuff. And by the way, another piece that ties in is the administrators side. The amount of administrators to faculty has really ballooned in higher education over the last several decades. So much so that we've cited some research from Dr. Richard Vedder, who's out of Ohio University here. And actually, I should have him hook up with you. If you've never met Richard Vedder, he's a hoot. He's one of the funniest guys you'll ever meet, and he knows everybody. I've been to his office. He's advised world leaders over decades. He's a great, great guy, true treasure here in Ohio. But he has been a rabid critic of how higher education has worked for years, and I think he's right. And he did research that indicated if you had kept the same ratio of administrators to students that we had back in, I think it was the 1970s, so about 50 years ago, you'd have approximately a 20% less tuition. So we need to excise some of that. And one way to excise that is to make sure that universities can't just offload their responsibility for producing good tax-paying good citizens.
Is there because really what you're talking about is you're going to give universities skin in the game, meaning they're going to have some risk. What we're really trying to get at is the source of the problem, which is the federal government subsidizing student loans. I mean, when the federal government got in the lending business and then guaranteed the loans, then it's a free-for-all. Universities can create wings of programs just to sell degrees that really, I think what you're saying is degrees that maybe don't have a whole lot of value on the outside. So is there any chance, whether with Trump or, hopefully we've got a number of years ahead with his or the people that will succeed him, is there any chance of getting the federal government out of the business? It just seems so insane to me that even if you've got Biden saying, look, these student loans are horrible, we should forgive them, but at the same time, they're still in the business of issuing them. So it's like they're not stopping. Is there any chance of getting the federal government, even with the current administration, state or local or otherwise, to achieve that? Because what you're really talking about is a little bit of an end around. So give the locals some skin in the game, but really the bigger problem is get the federal government out of the game.
Yeah, maybe put a cap on it or something.
Well, I think so. The short answer is I do think there is hope that we can start moving in that direction. It is so embedded in the culture that it is going to take a long time to sort of root out. Like a lot of these things,
ironically, it hasn't been that long. I mean, we're just going back to the 90s when this all sort of really took off.
It really did take off. And actually, one of the things that I've said for a while is, look, if taxpayers are going to, like I mentioned before with the return on investment, there's a lot of jobs that we need, in particular the STEM. So it's getting back to some of the stuff we were talking about with energy and the data centers and stuff. We have a real deficit of a lot of STEM students, especially a lot of American students. We have a lot of graduate level engineering and things like that, and frankly, a lot are from other countries that come in because universities get to pay them full freight, and they can get that money. And that's a whole other sort of issue, but it kind of interrelates here. we need to be training our own domestic workforce more. And if we, and so I think if we had more focusing of those resources, like the federal loans and things like that, into those areas, that would make more sense. What you really want to see is a skinning down of all of that, because by it being this open-ended kind of floodgate of funding, if you subsidize more, if you subsidize something, you're going to get more of it, right? And I mean, that's just
Yeah, you get what you pay for.
but if there's no real metrics as to what that is going to achieve, then you can get a million different gender studies people who are going to go out and protest all the time and complain about how unfair the world is, but they're not going to really be producing anything, and they're not going to be doing what we need as a society. We should be calibrating any subsidies that we do to things that are actually going to have a real return on the investment for the taxpayers by, again, creating those students. So I would say this. I think the federal government should definitely be scaling back dramatically on what it does, because that is, in the long run, the only way that you're going to limit it. There is probably some room for some focus on certain kinds of professions. Now, some people would say, well, that's picking winners and losers. But here's the thing. If you're spending taxpayer dollars, again, there needs to be something for it for everybody. It can't just be a thing where you spend that money and then the benefits all get privatized, to one person or something like that. We need to be smart about it. And actually, so I totally agree. We've got to excise a lot of this and really stop how we do it, limit the amount that we're spending in that space, and better target it to things that make sense. That's also one of our recommendations for the state subsidy. And honestly, the federal subsidies in the long run are the bigger issue, because that's the backstop that creates more. But Ohio spends over $1 billion a year in state general revenues on direct line item. It's called the state share of instruction, and it's a direct subsidy to four-year universities as well as community colleges. And one of I think our first recommendation in the report is that we need to refocus that particular line item or the formula, I should say, on how that's calculated. So where we embrace additional outcomes-based metrics, including things like earnings to debt ratio of folks that come out with a degree. Where do they go? How much do they make? How does that work towards their ability to pay off the debt that they have incurred? The better that is, and in other words, the higher obviously paying and the better sort of positions that you're doing, will give you a little bit. It doesn't change everything. It doesn't make that the only metric.
Right.
It shifts some of that so that we, again, are trying to improve that return on investment that we have for the individual students. So
well,
one at the state level, we want to see it for sure at the federal level.
Sure. One of your bullet points that I really like, and I think our program likes, are the micro kind of jobs where people are doing 2-year or certificated types of jobs. I ran into a young man that used to be a waiter at a restaurant I frequent, and he was just there to visit socially. And he mentioned that he got a certificate to be a nurse's assistant at a senior's home, and he's making way more money. And I asked him, well, what about maybe pursuing your nursing degree, like a 2-year, LPN or something? And that's where these tuition dollars where the state's going to invest per your paper is let's start also making those kinds of students more and more eligible for the state share of the loans or grants or what have you. Make those eligible for assistance, because there's a slew of those jobs that are needed. Welders, electricians, plumbers, pipe fitters, and those require either some kind of, a union, whatever you call it, where you were a student under the auspices.
Apprenticeship program.
Apprenticeships. And, I like that part of your paper.
Well, I have a question along those lines, and I've always been sort of curious about this, and because I really don't know what the policy is out of the state, say even the state government. So my son, for instance, is in an automotive program. In order to be in the automotive program, you have to have tools, and in order to have tools, you have to have somebody help you buy it. So then the Snap-on truck comes around and lends these kids $20, $30, $40,000 for a toolbox and tools, and they're not getting any subsidies. They're not getting any tuition remission. They're not getting anything at all. And I've always wondered if there was an equal protection type of argument to be had there. And if somebody were to actually pick up that torch and say, all right, we're going to attack it from the court side, for the constitutional side, maybe that is a chink in the armor to start dismantling.
Well, I can give you an example of at least specific. My cousin's son went to school through John Deere. And they pay, and as long as he works for this John Deere dealership for the next 4 years, I think it's 4 years after he graduates, it's all paid for.
Yeah, that's paid for, but that's a private side, which that's how it should
and
be.
it's a good example of it can work.
It absolutely can work.
Yeah. But anyway, didn't mean to jump in.
No, you're exactly right.
Great examples that it works.
This is where the market works. So
Yeah.
if the market will bear his tuition and then produce labor from it later on,
Exactly.
then the employers are going to do it. We don't need the government to fix that for us.
2 years in and out, and he's working.
But we got an expert here.
Yeah.
What say you?
Yeah.
Well, no, I think you're bringing it up. I mean, we have shifted a long ways. That used to be how a lot of things went. Obviously, the labor unions play a very big role. They have obviously an incentive to have people join the union and pay the dues, but by doing that, they provide a real service, in terms of training and working under the tutelage of people who've been there for a long time, the apprenticeship model, everything else. So, there are ways that we can get the market back into the space and do it. I will say that in an ideal world, that would be how we do most of this. Would be exactly the way the John Deere example, I think is great, right? I mean, you go to somebody, they know they need the workforce. They're willing to make an investment in that. And I do think one of the things that we've seen unfortunately happen is we've seen government step into a lot of these roles. And as government steps into these roles, you see sort of an atrophying of things that the private sector or even the charitable sector, the nonprofit sector has done. One of the things that has always worried me about it is, we do so much healthcare and things. I mean, this is not the higher ed side, but it's interrelated in the sense that the bigger government has gotten, the more we lose muscle memory in some of these other sort of civic institutions, civic associations. And the one thing that does worry me is that while I think we need to be paring a lot of this back, how do you get the muscle built back in those institutions so that they can kind of come to fill the void that would be at least temporarily left as the receding tide, so to speak, of government kind of pulls out? Who's going to step in to fill that? What capacity do they have to do it? At what rate can they do it? And
good example, Greg, is when I went to law school, I went to little savings and loans and small banks in the Cincinnati area because I went to UC College of Law, and I had to prove to them that I had good credit and I was going to pay back that student loan, because even though the federal government knocked the interest rate down to, I think it was 9% at the time, because a home loan then was like 15%. The student loan rate was bought down by the federal government to say 8-9%. But yet if I defaulted, it was on that bank. That bank was going to lose, they would have to chase me. So that muscle memory that you're talking about in the lending community, it's all gone. As Steve says, it's the federals now.
And one thing I'd love to see, we didn't put this in the paper, and this is a little bit out there. It's a little bit on the limb. And so it's kind of shifting, they call it the Overton window, where you can shift what's acceptable. Discourse is always within this particular window. And as you shift it, you kind of change what is an acceptable sort of discussion on policy or cultural matters, whatnot. But one thing is there, and I think it exists in some very small cases, but this is where you have almost a package of investors even that take a look at the potential future earnings of a student, and you do sort of a situation where you essentially pay back the investors over time for the front-loaded cost of the education, and then it's a private kind of packaged thing there, which I think, and I don't know that I suspect that wouldn't work in all cases, and it probably works in particularly high-end sort of high-yield, high-talent sort of individuals, but we should allow for those kind of contractual arrangements to the extent that people want to voluntarily engage in that. We should certainly be doing that and probably even promoting that to the most extent we can.
Well, I could tell you this parent is so I actually have contracts with both of my sons for part of their parental education loans. And I'm being paid back, monthly at a certain amount. It's zero interest. I'm not making money, but I want my sons to have skin in the game so that they go to class, do their homework, because if they drop out of school or graduate, either way, they got to pay mom and dad back.
Yeah, we did the same thing for Madeline, our oldest, ended up getting tons of scholarships. So we walked out zero on that one, thank God, and she, bless her. But yeah, with our son Hayden going through nursing, same thing. We did the paperwork. It's like, okay, this is what it is. It's going to be 0%.
It's what you're talking about, Greg.
But we're investing in him. We know he's going to be great. But third party, I'd say that's not a bad idea at all.
Then Uncle Sam sees all this, sees this competition for the federal student loan program, and gets the SEC involved and say you can't do this without meeting all the regulatory requirements of being a bank. You can just see
probably right. That's the problem.
Exactly.
And you nail that on the head. And this is where, get back to your question originally, is I am cautiously optimistic. I think that the new administration in Washington and the potential that some of these ideas are going to go forward. I will say that I think Vice President Vance, I had a chance to get to know him a little bit before he even ran for the Senate seat. And I will say he's one of the more, I work with a lot of leaders. I work with a lot of political folks for a long period of time. That's one of my roles at Buckeye, actually, is I do the research, but I actually spend a lot of my time, especially during budget season, I spend more of my time at the State House working with legislators directly on things. And he's one of the smartest people I've met. Truly clever. He has a very philosophical framework that he is operating from. And he, I think, intuitively and experience, just from his own personal experiences too, understands these kind of issues, and he talks about these kind of things. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we will start to see some shifting. I don't think we're going to get to the promised land soon, because there's so much embedded there. But the more we can cut back on those layers, the better we're going to be. And I do think we have an administration willing to move in that direction.
So, Greg, we got to bring you back more frequently, but if you can just bust through where do we stand on Ed Choice funding? That would be the third big announcement coming out of Buckeye here in January. And January's not over yet, so I'm sure you have more. Hit school choice, Ed Choice. And then let's talk a little bit about these amicus briefs very quickly. So if you can kind of do like 10 minutes. Maybe.
Sure. So the bottom line is on Ed Choice, we've universalized Ed Choice here in Ohio. And so what that meant was that every student that wants to get a scholarship or a voucher is eligible to get it. There's a sliding scale. If you get a full amount, which is a little over $6,000 for K through 8, and then over 8 for 9 through 12 or high school. But if you hit the 450% of the federal poverty guidelines, gosh, it's at 100, something like, I think maybe 130 for a family of 4. I could be off a little bit on that number. So
I think you're right. Yeah.
Then you start to have a sliding scale, so you don't get the full amount of the voucher. But everybody's eligible now, and obviously it's been getting. We think this is a great thing. We think we should be funding students, not systems. Schools exist, education systems exist for the students. They don't exist to perpetuate themselves and to perpetuate the bureaucracy. And I think all too often public school districts have a tendency to fall into that sort of mindset where they sort of perpetuate themselves. So funding students is big. We have moved a great deal in that direction with these programs, but there's still a lot more that we need to do. And this is some of the stuff we're going to be talking about as we deal with the state budget, which is going to, Governor DeWine is going to issue his budget proposal on, I believe, February 3rd, so coming up fairly soon. And then we're going to spend all the way through the end of June talking about the next 2-year budget here in Ohio. This is going to be a big portion of it is education funding, both for the public school districts, but also how does that work for school choice? We're very glad that we've got the eligibility where it is. We want to work on trying to make sure that we're improving the incentives for all families to be able to take advantage of this, including families that a lot of times are lower income families. They already get a full voucher. We think there's some policies we could do to kind of add some additional resources for students that may have some additional struggles to be able to take that voucher to a school of their choice and be able to get some of the additional services that they might need, which, by the way, we already spend those extra dollars on students if they go to a public district school or if they go to a public charter school. We don't do that yet with vouchers. We want to see some additional funding there. There's a disadvantaged student funding that's available for those other students, but not yet the voucher students. We want to see some of that happen. We also recognize that as we're seeing more students take advantage of these school choice options, we need to make sure there's physical capacity for these students. And there's a whole host of issues with buildings, making classroom space available. There's, renovating certain kinds of buildings. Frankly, as public school enrollment declines, there's opportunities to maybe be able to leverage already pre-existing school buildings, but frankly, school districts have a tendency to, even though they're supposed to basically sell them to like charter school operators, unused buildings, they find a remarkable number of ways to avoid doing that. So that because they don't like the competition in their backyard, we think we need to tighten some language in that space to make it easier to have all these school choice options coming online. And probably the other biggest thing that is going to be a challenge for school choice is transportation. You've probably all heard about that there were all kinds of problems here in Columbus with transporting schools, students to some of the private schools that were voucher students, or even some of the charter schools. That's a really big issue. That's probably worth its own show, so I'm not going to go too far down the rabbit hole on that one. But transportation in education is possibly the hottest and the most important issue. Some school districts have been very obstreperous in trying to oppose helping out school students, but I will to give fairness, they have bus driver deficits. We have challenges. They have labor shortage challenges. And it is inefficient how we do things now. When you have transportation run through districts, it's inefficient for them to have to pick up 2 students for one charter school and 1 student over here to this, private school over here. And then we've got all of our regular district school students on the normal route. We need to rationalize that process. And so that is a big point of discussion. We do have some ideas, but that'll open up an entire other conversation. I'll come back and talk about that.
When you're dealing with that, and just briefly, I don't want to belabor any of this because we do want to go through a bunch of stuff, but you mentioned something about building new buildings within a school district. That puts pressure on the taxpayers, though. Isn't that they're going to go push back on the choice then?
Well, what we're talking about is, are there ways to renovate existing buildings or to use underutilized buildings that were already in existence?
Okay, rather than a new build. Okay.
Not necessarily building a whole new building.
I got you. Okay.
Right.
Which is great. That's what should be done, is revitalize what's already there. I agree.
Another thing that affects primary and secondary education hugely is the way that we have, local control over our school boards. We have, if you count up all the county boards of ed and the MRDDs and every other kind of school, we have 800 school districts or entities in Ohio versus, say, a state like Florida, where each county runs the schools. So Florida has like 43, whatever counties, whatever number it is, 60, whatever it is. That's exactly how many school districts they have because it's a county school district. We have 800. So think of how top heavy we are in management and duplicative administrative things and transportation. You've got districts that are busing through another school district. Like I live out in Licking County. You have Northridge School District on both sides of Johnstown, Northridge buses running through Johnstown to the other side of the district. I mean, it's insane, right? So we need consolidation, perhaps, which is, again, a whole other issue.
It's a whole other show. But I just want to say the first paper I wrote for the Buckeye Institute over a decade ago was on consolidation of local governments, including school districts, for exactly the reasons that you were citing. This has been a big issue. And I'll tell you this, the property tax issue, which we haven't touched on today, but is one of the, I would say that the 3 biggest issues we're going to be focusing on during the budget or the next 6 months is the state budget is the biggest thing. But this energy package has just been introduced and deals with the stuff we were talking about earlier, and property taxes. The increases, and property taxes are downstream of structure, I say. And I've been saying this for years, but people don't pay attention until there's pain. We've got to reform local government because the reason you've got 20 or 30 different levies on your property is because of how many different local government entities you have, which gets to the point you were talking about. So I could not agree more, actually. And the example you just gave is one I'm going to now file away because I think it's absurd. You're driving through. I always think about the bus. They have two buses going down the same street because, one side is one district, the other district is the other side of the street. But it's even worse when you're literally going through an entire district because it's kind of the way that the roads work and stuff. It doesn't make sense. It's irrational. And honestly, it doesn't work well for the districts. It just doesn't work well for the districts either. And then they get mad because you'd say, oh, you got to do this. And they're like, well, how am I supposed to do that? And sometimes I think districts aren't they hate school choice in general. And so I think they try to throw up roadblocks. And I disagree profoundly with them for doing that. However, they're not altogether wrong when they say that these are real issues and are real problems. And you can't just wave a magic wand. We need smarter policy. Probably need to regionalize transportation, but that is an entire, almost a Pandora's box to open on that one.
Yeah. Well, what is because we're talking about I would think that is a solvable problem, a Pandora's box problem it may be, but ultimately solvable if everybody really wanted to solve it. But it seems like there's a bigger, more fundamental objection to school choice on the other side. And I just sort of put that in quotes, the other side. So one side talks about school choice. I mean, look, I was sold on this after reading Thomas Sowell. It makes perfect sense. But so I would just ask people, well, why not? What is the counter argument? What is really underlying this? Because I can't imagine it's the small logistical stuff. There's got to be something bigger that is a pushback on this.
Well, I think the public districts ultimately see that they see themselves as a monopoly. They see themselves, and not just a monopoly in the economic sense. I think they have a moral sense that that's what public education is meant to do, and that when you have too much private options or other options that are there, it splinters the community. It doesn't allow for there to be similar values and stuff like that put together, and it's going to only benefit. A lot of folks would probably tell you that it only benefits wealthy people who take advantage of school choice and things like that. So it is, to your point, a deeply held philosophical view.
Well,
Sometimes
Steve,
behind the logistics, but it's philosophical.
Steve also tees up perfectly when he asks, well, what's the other interest here? He tees up perfectly this amicus brief or litigation that Buckeye's involved with, Sheldon versus OPSI, the Ohio Association of Public School Employees. So if you get into that amicus brief, that sort of answers part of Steve's question. I mean, obviously, it's their ox getting gored when you take away dues or you take away job slots from the public school employees, your janitors, cafeteria workers, school bus drivers, other people besides the teachers.
Well, it creates competition. You got to You got to up your game, right? If they're not choosing your school, you would ask why, and maybe that's at the heart of it. Is that there's that insecurity about we don't want to up our game.
Well,
and
I think in public schools, maybe it's similar to what's going on in universities as well too. Administration levels are way higher than the teacher levels.
Yeah.
So to me, it looks as that way. It's like, okay, why is it a ratio of 5 to 1 in this school district? As an example, that's heavy too. And it's like, okay, the money's going to administration rather than helping teachers do their job better.
Yeah.
Well,
ultimately.
this OPSI case is about a guy who was a member of the union for several years, decided he didn't like their political positions, and said, I don't want my dues being removed from my paycheck. So he wants from the time he notified the union, I'm dropping out of the union, he wants those dues back, and you have entered into the case with a position. Because, again, you're talking about monopolistic control. They want to monopolize not only the schools that you're allowed to go to, and of course, Ed Choice has cracked that wide open, but they also want to monopolize who is allowed to work for the school district and who has to be in the union, and can people drop out, out of the union if they disagree. So if you want to address that a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, it's an important case because essentially there was a case from the U.S. Supreme Court several years ago called the Janus case. I think came out of Illinois, and it essentially was for years you had to be a member of the union, or you had to have your dues deducted, or I mean, you could theoretically not be a member of the union, but you still basically had to pay what functionally were dues. And so, in a certain sense, that's kind of like wage theft. If you want to be a member, then you absolutely should pay dues, because you're going to be taking advantage of the benefits and things of that nature that the union does. And so that makes sense. But if that's not what you want to do, you should be allowed to choose what to do on your own. And there's some other things we need to do in this space to I think, continue to go down the road of freedom for the individual workers to make their own decisions. But at the end of the day, if you have communicated to a union now under this Supreme Court decision that essentially said you can't compel, and this is mostly public sector unions, which I do think actually there's a huge difference between public sector unions and like labor unions. There's a massive distinction between those two things. And so the Janus case is essentially what I would characterize as right to work for public sector unions. Folks don't have to pay dues, or don't have to be a member of the union. They don't have to pay the dues there. They can't be compelled to do it. That's essentially compellence and frankly compelled speech too, especially when unions speak on so many issues, which was the case in the situation here that we had with our current client that we have, Mr. Sheldon, and essentially he said, "Hey, I want to quit my union." He told his unions that he wanted to get out of it, and then they basically sat on it for about, I think it was around 4 months or so, that they literally didn't respond. They eventually basically said, "Oh, okay, well, we'll finally honor the request," and then they did stop taking money at that point, but they didn't refund him any of the money that they had taken out for the time period between when he had indicated he wanted to get out of the union and the time that they very, very, very belatedly acknowledged that. And so what we're sort of saying is, well, you can't do that. He was very clear that, it's not, and of course they could have let him out as soon as he had requested it. And I would, venture to say that there's reasons they didn't do that. And so we're trying to say, no, you can't do that. That's inconsistent with what we have at the U.S. Supreme Court level with the Janus case. And you guys got to take care of this. You can't stop doing that, because in a very real sense, I mean, it sounds pretty intense to say, but it's wage theft when you continue to deduct something from somebody who has already made a bona fide communication saying that they don't want to be a part of this anymore. So we need to get those back. We need to get his money back, and frankly, get some damages back for the fact that they took money from him that it should have been taken from him. And really, this should be a notice to all these other public sector unions. Don't do it. When somebody says they want to get out, don't try to hide behind these arcane contractual rules and BS and stuff like that they do, because they try to. You can only opt out of your union on the second Thursday of the 4th month of the 5th year kind of thing. I mean, they literally try to create these extraordinarily small windows to make it as hard as they possibly can. And it's intentional. There's a reason they do that.
It's like canceling a gym
as
membership.
easy as possible.
Yeah. Jeez, no kidding.
Well, look, we're pushing towards the end here, and we got to move on now. Now, I guess we'll quote Winston Churchill before we go to wonderfully outrageous. But before I do that, I wanted to ask you, what is the status of that case? Has it been argued? Are we waiting a decision, or where are we with it?
I think that the latest that we have is, I know that we have filed the case, and so we filed the case. So we haven't even had the oral arguments or anything else. There's a lot. Okay. We're still in the early days of the litigation here.
Can you also tell us what's the status of this Oneida County eminent domain case, where a eminent domain is being used by government to take property from private individuals and give it to developers instead? So the state or the local government is not taking the property in order to put a fire department on that land. They're taking the property to hand it over to a developer to put in a shopping mall. So that was a case of Kilo, and you guys are fighting against that decision, which I think Stephen Breyer, I can't remember the name of the justice, or David somebody that used to be on the Supreme Court, he authored that opinion. And,
might have been Souter. Souter was for it.
David Souter.
I can't remember. But it is the Kilo case, and that was, I think, it's a very controversial case, because essentially it's a takings case.
Right.
And you take somebody's property, and the idea is, of course, constitutionally, you got to be able to provide fair and just compensation for that. And effectively, what Kelo allowed for in certain circumstances is for that.
So you're trying to overturn that, Greg.
That is correct.
What's that case?
And I want to clarify a wonderful group that we do work with called the Institute for Justice. They filed the case, so it's their client. We are filing an amicus brief on this case so that it will be what we're trying to get is this is the writ of certiorari stage. So we're trying to get this U.S. Supreme Court to take it. They have not yet agreed to take the case, and that's why we did the amicus. We believe that that precedent that you're referring to in Kelo, we think is very, very problematic, very unfair to people, but we need the case to be taken up by the court in order to then argue the case so that there's a chance to overturn that particular precedent.
Okay. Our colleague Steve had to run to court. He is a practicing attorney, so he literally had to dip out. Let's go to our positives and negatives and wrap the show up. So let's start with our guest. What would you say over the past week with a fire hose full of news coming out of D.C.? Perhaps that or something that is in your own bailiwick. The past week's outrage of the week, and the good thing that you saw this past week. Go ahead.
Fortunately, this has been a week where I don't know that I have a good outrage this week. For the most part, I feel like this has been a pretty good week. I feel we've got a long ways to go. I think there's a lot of hope out there. I mean, I think that the new administration in Washington is a administration that's going to think very differently about things and is going to be far more inclined to empower states, which we think is the right thing to do. And so I'd say that is probably by far the thing that I'd say I'm the most personally optimistic about. I know there's going to be, they can't do it all. There's no way it's going to happen. Again, we didn't get to the situation where we have some of the challenges we have today overnight. So you can't fix these issues overnight. But the first thing you got to do is start taking steps in that direction. And if you're taking steps in the wrong direction, and I would argue the last administration was not just taking steps, but like practically trying to sprint in the opposite direction of what needed to happen. We're I think moving in the right direction. I'll say too, I think that we have a positive situation here at the Ohio State House. I think there are some big items, some big policy discussions that are going to be taking place both in the budget and in some of this energy discussion that we were talking about for a good chunk of the show. I'm cautiously optimistic. I think we're going to get better policy than what we have today. I don't know that we're going to get, like everything else, you never get everything you want, but I think that we have a chance to get better policy than we've had in Ohio probably for about 20 years, at least in energy and potentially a couple of other places too. So I actually am pretty bullish on things. I've been around long enough to know that, that's why I always want to say cautiously optimistic because I don't want to get disappointed because you're not going to get all of the things that should happen. But I think we've got some real opportunities here, and this has been a week.
That's awesome, man. And I hope that this buoyancy that we're all feeling, most of America seems to be feeling, I hope it continues, to your point. I'll do mine, and then Brett can do his, and he can wrap the show up. Brett's got good experience being the MC of this thing. My positive is this week, to the point that the president campaigned on about illegal immigrant crime. 4 Chilean home robbers, burglars, were arrested by the State Patrol, and they were illegal immigrants, a gang that had broken into Joe Burrow, NFL Bengals quarterback extraordinaire, broke into his house, stole a bunch of stuff, and they found jerseys and other artifacts in the vehicle when they arrested him. So that's good. My outrage, and this kind of ties into an amicus brief that you guys filed, my outrage is that this Corporate Transparency Act, which keeps getting bounced around federal courts, 1 week we have to comply, and then they extend the deadline past January 1st, the original deadline to comply, and our little partnership. I filed mine. And so now the Treasury Department has all this personal information, because I went ahead and filed under the previous deadlines, and it's now been suspended. And I don't know what the Trump administration is going to do with this regulation or not, but it stinks. And that would be the thing that I think I'm outraged by, and I hope that it gets solved.
Yeah. Wonderful. This is going to sound odd, but I am glad. I love Ohio State. Never went there, but I love the national championship. Obviously, they won. But I'm glad Notre Dame made a game of it of the second half. Yeah, that was a fun game to watch. It was a very fun game, and I'm glad of the outcome, that sort of thing. And I think Notre Dame played a great game. We did the better came out of it. That's fine. But that's my win for the week. I am very hopeful too. Reading what you put together here from the Buckeye Institute, it really shines light on the minutia that the Ohio House is putting through for any education stuff. If they could just really look at the nuts and bolts of changing things versus, House bill that it's DEI stuff or gender stuff. There are bigger fish to fry than having to worry about that. And I understand that is what they need to address. I understand they want to get this kind of stuff through, but you've brought to light a lot of stuff that it really moves the needle versus the stuff they're pushing through. So having you on has been a great positive too, to help me look at some stuff a little bit differently too. The negative for me, the outrage is it scares me a little bit in regards to we have representatives around the country who are, criticizing statements from the inaugural prayer and asking for deportation because of what she said. That bothers me. It bothers me a lot. I think what she had to say was fine. It was not saying vote one way, vote one another. I think it's, think about what you're doing. Put some conscience to it. I don't know. There's a lot of outrage with it. It just bothered me that we're calling for deportation of people that have said something. That's a little bit overboard, and not that it has any legs, but it's concerning. Let's put it that way. So. But thank you for being on the show again. Yeah, second time around. This has been enlightening, great topics and great stuff that you guys are putting spotlight to. Thank you so much. What's the best way that our listener can find out more about what you guys are doing?
Yeah, your website.
Yeah,
visit buckeyeinstitute.org. That's our website. We've got our policy work on there, our litigation. We've got a whole page on all the stuff that we're involved with there. Check it out. We're a nonprofit. We don't take government money. We try to keep people's taxpayer money in their own wallet, and we don't take grants or anything from the government as a matter of basically our charter. So obviously we're basically funded through generosity of individuals, like a lot of like I think nonprofits really should be. So appreciate it, and thank you for having me on. And thanks for the background that you all have is really fun too. So it allows for a really good back and forth on a lot of really, really good issues. And let's talk about the budget when it comes out. We'll have some specifics to talk about there, and it'll be that's coming soon. And like talking with you. So thanks again.
Thanks, Greg.
You bet. And catch everything that we do at the podcast at commonsenseohioshow.com. And we'll have another show coming up next week. See you then.